The first sign came so quietly that most systems didn't even register it as significant. But buried in the data logs from ground-based telescopes across Chile, Spain and Australia was a subtle shift. Barely half a degree, yet unmistakable. The anti-tail of 3I Atlas had begun to move, not blur, not dissipate, but pivot. It was December 17th, just one day before its closest approach to Earth. Up until then, 3I Atlas had behaved like a contradiction wrapped in motion. It survived perihelion, it fed on sunlight, it redirected its jets, and now, just 24 hours before skimming past Earth, it appeared to be realigning its geometry. Anti-tails are rare features, often misunderstood even by astronomers. In typical comets, the tail points away from the Sun due to solar wind pressure. An anti-tail, appearing to stretch toward the Sun, has always been considered a trick of perspective. Dust particles lag behind the comet's orbital path and, from certain vantage points, seem to form a tail in reverse. But with 3I Atlas, this anti-tail was different. For weeks it had maintained form, not fading in and out like dust clouds tend to do. It was clean, narrow, structured, and critically it responded to vector forces, not passive drift. It wasn't illusion, it was action. Now, in the span of an hour, that action had shifted. Images captured from Cerro Paranal Observatory showed the anti-tail slowly detaching from its original angle. At first, analysts suspected tracking error. These shifts are often blamed on Earth's own orbital movement, or slight variances in camera positioning. But this time, software correction models failed. The shift wasn't on our end, it was in the object. More telescopes joined the focus. New images came in from Mauna Kea, from the Canary Islands, and from smaller stations spread across Eastern Europe. All showed the same thing. The anti-tail was flipping. It wasn't a collapse. It wasn't a dispersal. The stream of material, which had previously extended sunward, was now arcing away, slowly bending toward Earth's relative position in space. And that was the moment everyone realized this wasn't a comet acting under thermal stress. It was a system redirecting its energy output, and it was doing so with timing that suggested coordination, not chaos. In classical comet theory, jets are chaotic. Their direction is influenced by surface topology, temperature gradients, and material volatility. When a nucleus rotates, these jets shift with sunlight exposure. But what we saw from 3I Atlas wasn't that. The orientation change wasn't consistent with solar heating. The spin of the nucleus wasn't in phase with the jet realignment. And most importantly, the reorientation wasn't gradual over days. It happened in less than 12 hours. Radio observatories quickly adjusted their targets. VLBI arrays in Australia and South Africa tuned in, hoping to catch emissions that might suggest magnetic coupling. But what they found was silence, followed by structured ion line emissions that began to rise just as the anti-tail reached its new vector. For scientists tracking the object, this was the final confirmation. We weren't looking at ejected particles drifting backward through space. We were watching mass redirection. Some tried to explain it as a volatile pocket igniting, perhaps triggered by accumulated solar heating. But the math didn't line up. Volatile ignition would show up as brightness flares, thermal spikes, and chaotic jetting. None of those appeared. Instead, light curves flattened, thermal readings dropped, jetting stabilized, and the anti-tail, now fully flipped, locked into a new orientation with such elegance that the phrase reactionless began to show up in the internal memos. By the end of December 17th, one conclusion had begun to settle uncomfortably across the scientific community. 3I Atlas had just performed a maneuver. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, a maneuver. And the countdown to closest approach had officially begun. The more closely astronomers examined the anti-tail shift, the clearer one contradiction became. 3I Atlas was defying the most fundamental force acting on every comet, solar radiation pressure. Normally, the equation is simple. The sun pushes, the comet yields. That's how tails form. That's why they stream away, always pointed opposite the solar vector. Whether the particles are ions, ice, dust, or volatile molecules, the outcome is the same. The pressure of photons and charged particles streaming from the sun pushes everything outward, away from the source of light and heat. It's as predictable as gravity, as natural as sunrise. And yet, in the case of 3I Atlas, the opposite was happening. For days, the object had maintained an anti-tail pointing toward the sun, not away. The first explanations were cautious: projection effects, dust lag, gravitational lensing artifacts. But as more data poured in from a wide array of telescopes positioned around the globe and from orbital instruments in heliocentric orbits, that justification began to crumble. This was no optical illusion. The anti-tail was composed of freshly ejected particles, still warm and radiant in the infrared, and they were not drifting passively. They were being directed toward the sun. That single fact upended years of consensus. For the anti-tail to form and remain coherent, something inside 3I Atlas had to be actively ejecting material against the direction of solar radiation pressure. In other words, it was pushing into the solar wind like swimming upstream. This isn't a metaphor. The particles making up the anti-tail were literally fighting the flow of radiation and charged solar particles, and they were winning. To do that, 3I Atlas would need energy. Not a little, a lot. More energy than could be accounted for by natural heating at its current orbital distance. Scientists calculated the expected solar flux at 1.6 astronomical units, the approximate position of the object during the flip. That value yields a predictable amount of heating, enough to cause sublimation in normal icy bodies, but not nearly enough to launch solid or ionized particles toward the sun at the velocities observed, especially not without the object rotating wildly from recoil. But here's the twist. 3I Atlas wasn't spinning chaotically. Its light curve remained stable, its shape consistent. No torque, no roll, just calm, sustained ejection against the sun's will. And now, as the anti-tail flipped and reoriented into a new geometry, that defiance only deepened. Researchers at the ESA's Solar Physics Unit issued a quiet notice. Observed anti-solar orientation is inconsistent with modelled sublimation vectors under standard thermodynamic response models. In simpler terms, the tail was going the wrong way, and the object didn't seem to care what the models predicted. It was executing its own plan. By the end of the analysis window, it became undeniable. 3I Atlas was not a passive body absorbing sunlight and venting gas randomly. It was behaving like a system, one with internal logic and control. Some theorists began floating possibilities that had previously been off limits in official discourse. Could the anti-tail be part of a propulsion strategy? Could the sunward jet, the very mechanism causing the tail to reverse, be an engineered output, one that converts solar energy into directional mass ejection? It wasn't an outlandish question anymore. With the tail resisting radiation pressure and accelerating into the source of heat, the only consistent conclusion was that we were witnessing active redirection. And while some scientists tried to frame it as exotic comet chemistry, others quietly started using different language: sunward impulse, vector symmetry, opposed ejection strategy. These weren't comet terms, these were spacecraft terms. So the anti-tail didn't just flip, it challenged physics. It demonstrated that 3I Atlas isn't just defying the sun's pressure, it's using it. And in doing so, it forced us to rethink what passive even means in the vacuum between stars. Because when something fights the wind and wins, you stop calling it a leaf, you start calling it a sail. By early morning on December 18th, what had started as a curious directional shift had transformed into something more unsettling. The anti-tail of 3I Atlas wasn't just moving, it was behaving. And for the first time, scientists weren't describing its motion as passive at all. Typically, a comet's tail, whether composed of dust or ionized gases, behaves like an afterthought of the sun's influence, a consequence, not a command. Outgassing from the sunlit side releases volatile material, and that material is then pushed away from the sun by radiation pressure and the solar wind. It's not precise, it's not clean, it's chaotic. That's the nature of comets. Jets ignite and flicker. Dust escapes in unpredictable plumes. Solar wind bends and distorts everything. The results are often beautiful but never symmetrical. But what scientists observed now was neither chaotic nor distorted. The anti-tail had aligned itself with an orientation that implied purpose. Over the course of 3 hours, high-resolution imaging from the Subaru telescope in Hawaii and the La Silla Observatory in Chile both confirmed that the anti-tail had narrowed. Its beam-like shape wasn't dispersing in the wake of motion, it was concentrating. That tail, which was supposed to be a scattered trail of particle residue, was instead tightening into a collimated stream. And then the emissions changed. spectrographic analysis revealed a significant shift in the energy profile of the expelled material. Where previously the anti-tail had shown a balanced presence of water vapour, carbon dioxide and hydroxyl fragments, standard signs of cometary sublimation, it now displayed a strong increase in carbon monoxide and carbonyl sulfide, along with anomalous peaks at narrow-band ionized wavelengths that didn't fit standard comet chemistry. In fact, one of the spikes appeared at a band associated with electrically excited oxygen atoms, a line typically seen in high-energy auroral activity, not comet trails. The meaning was immediate. This wasn't just venting. This was controlled particle acceleration. The particles weren't drifting. They were being energized, organized, and shaped. Even more curiously, the anti-tail was no longer following the orbital path of residual dust. It was slightly offset. It curved upward relative to the plane of ejection. That was not something dust clouds do. That was something no one had ever seen before, a structure holding shape outside its expected orbital axis. It wasn't long before plasma physicists started chiming in. A team at the Max Planck Institute in Germany issued a short statement describing the observed tail as showing persistent field alignment characteristics. In lay terms, it appeared that the anti-tail was responding to, or even generating, a magnetic field. Normally, solar-wind interaction with comet material results in disruption. The tail breaks into fragments. Ion filaments snap and recombine. But the structure of the 3I Atlas anti-tail remained stable, and it was pulsing. Not visibly, but in terms of its emission strength. Detectors recorded periodic fluctuations at regular interval, like breathing. At this point, the terminology changed. Scientists stopped calling it an anti-tail. They began referring to it as a vector field trace, a term that, while technical, implies something extraordinary, that the stream might not be passive debris at all, it might be a signature, a trace of directed motion, a system mapping out its own trajectory, or broadcasting it. The possibility opened up a dangerous new avenue of thought. Was the anti-tail not just a byproduct of 3I Atlas's internal processes, but a means of interaction? Some even suggested it was signaling, though not in the cinematic sci-fi way, not binary code or radio waves, but perhaps in movement, in vector shaping, in plasma field modulation. Something closer to a beacon or a navigational flare. Because if 3I Atlas was a natural object, its tail should be a result. Instead, it looked like a decision. And in that realization, Earth's planetary monitoring systems moved from observation to response. As the anti-tail realigned and tightened like a guided stream of light, the question shifted from what it was doing to how it was doing it. That's when the footage came in. High-speed visual data from the Solar Terrestrial Relations Observatory, STEREO-A, was scheduled to capture 3I Atlas from a unique lateral angle, one that allowed a rare glimpse of both the tail and the nucleus at the same time. The footage was meant to support studies on ion dispersal velocity. Instead, it revealed a secret hidden in the way the object expelled material: precision. The video was analysed frame by frame at the Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland. What emerged was not chaos, not randomness, it was synchronization. The jets of material erupting from 3I Atlas's surface didn't stutter or surge. They pulsed in consistent rhythm, turning on and off like pistons, with each cycle lasting precisely 12.4 seconds. One jet on the sunward side ignited first, followed by another on the trailing edge, then a third diagonally across the nucleus. The pattern repeated. It was mechanical, predictable, rehearsed. This was not the kind of outgassing that natural comets display. Ordinary jets erupt as solar heat reaches volatile-rich pockets, randomly distributed across the surface. The rotation of the nucleus causes different areas to face the sun, producing erratic bursts as temperatures fluctuate. The result is usually unstable. The comet wobbles, spins, and sometimes even fractures. That's not what happened here. Instead, 3I Atlas's nucleus remained extraordinarily stable during the entire cycle. The emissions never caused recoil. There was no tumbling, no acceleration off-axis, no deviation from trajectory. It was as if the jets were self-balancing, each new burst compensating for the last in a perfectly timed ballet. The thermal energy curves even showed a gentle, oscillating rise and fall in surface temperature at each emission point, confirming that the activity wasn't explosive, it was controlled. One planetary dynamicist described it as rotational thruster symmetry without torque. That phrase, while technical, carried an implication few dared to say out loud. The jets were not reacting to solar heat. They were being triggered, and they were being done so in a way that preserved balance, suggesting internal calculations and adjustments, like a stabilization system on a spacecraft. To explore this further, the University of Tokyo's Institute for Space and Astronautical Science ran a simulation using known cometary dynamics. The team attempted to reproduce the observed jet pattern with natural heating models. Every simulation failed. The randomness of sublimation couldn't match the timing. The geometry couldn't hold. The surface materials fractured under stress. It was impossible to get 3 jets to ignite in phase without rotational distortion, unless the emissions were not the result of heat at all, but rather electrically controlled discharge. This opened up a wild new possibility, that the tail itself, especially the sunward-aimed anti-tail, was being fed by coordinated mass ejection from multiple points. Not one vent, but a network, a jet system, and that network was now firing in rhythm. Stereo's instruments confirmed that after every jet cycle, the brightness of the anti-tail increased slightly, followed by a brief drop in radio emissions, a repeating pattern. Light, then silence, pulse, then calm. Scientists described it as photonic breath, a metaphor, but not far from the truth. This sequence wasn't just an atmospheric curiosity, it was a revelation, because it confirmed, visually and in real time, that the tail was not just a trailing stream of gas, it was the result of a timed, synchronized output system. Something inside 3i Atlas was coordinating the flow, directing it, using it. The jets were not passive events, they were instructions, executed with stunning precision. And for those watching closely, the conclusion was clear. We were no longer observing a comet. We were witnessing a system, performing maneuvers. By the time the jets had synchronized and the anti-tail had completed its eerie, deliberate flip, one question sat heavily in the minds of everyone watching. Why hasn't it broken apart? Comets are fragile. That's not speculation, it's physics. From the earlier studies of Halley's Comet to the more recent Rosetta mission to 67P, the consensus has remained the same. These bodies are ancient, brittle agglomerations of dust, ice, and loosely bound rock. They're cold survivors of early solar systems, but they're not engineered for stress. When they pass close to stars or change orientation violently, they break, they fragment, they collapse. It's not dramatic, it's inevitable. But not 3i Atlas. Despite the intensity of its jet output, despite the directional shift of the anti-tail, and despite undergoing what could only be described as a real-time course correction, 3i Atlas remained completely intact. High magnification imagery showed no signs of surface cracking, no secondary fragments, no dissipation of its central core, just one singular, coherent, perfectly stable structure, calmly rotating at a consistent rate as if nothing unusual had occurred. This baffled comet specialists. In fact, it offended some. Because even under normal solar heating, most comets develop stress fractures across their nucleus. When one side heats up and begins sublimating, internal pressure rises, gas pockets can erupt violently, causing structural failure. When jets ignite, particularly in multiple directions, torque builds up, spinning the nucleus or causing it to tumble out of control. Add to this the gravitational gradient from a nearby star and you typically have a recipe for disintegration. So why wasn't this one even showing signs of wear? At the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, researchers performed stress mapping simulations on 3i Atlas, using available size estimates and inferred density profiles. Under standard physics, the object should have fractured during its first round of jet synchronizations, especially once the anti-tail flipped and began shedding material toward the sun. The pressure differential alone should have been enough to cause spalling, or at least generate surface fissures, but nothing happened. Not only did the structure remain unbroken, but the thermal emission maps showed no hotspots, no runaway heating, no internal blowouts. The object appeared to be dispersing heat evenly across its surface, an ability that no known comet possesses. Natural bodies with uneven albedo and patchy volatile distribution tend to show thermal imbalances. Here, the surface temperature curve was unnaturally smooth. That's when the discussion shifted from structure to materials. Could it be that 3I Atlas was not composed of the same fragile material as typical comets? Spectral analysis had already confirmed a higher than normal concentration of carbon monoxide and carbonyl sulfide. But newer readings hinted at something more exotic, potential traces of nickel compounds and graphitized carbon, both of which are far more resistant to thermal stress and structural fatigue than porous ice. One particularly controversial theory emerged from the Kavli Institute, that the nucleus of 3I Atlas might not be an icy shell at all, but rather a layered composite, capable of absorbing stress and distributing thermal energy like a controlled heat sink. It would explain why the jets could fire without recoil, why the anti-tail could flip without fracture, why this body, which should behave like a snowball in a furnace, instead behaved like a stabilized craft. But the most unsettling realization came from what wasn't seen. There were no microfragments, not a single observable piece had broken off during the maneuver. Not even dust flares. The coma remained consistent with no sudden brightening. That level of stability under such dynamic conditions is more than unusual. It's virtually impossible for an unreinforced natural object. This forced planetary defense analysts to add a new classification to their internal files: persistent structural cohesion under acceleration. It's not a phrase you typically associate with comets, it's a phrase used in aerospace. Because when something endures force without strain and change without collapse, it begins to sound less like debris and more like design. While orbital telescopes tracked 3I Atlas from deep space vantage points, something unexpected happened closer to home. Earth-based observatories began to detect movement not in the object itself, but in the shadows it cast across background star fields. At first, it didn't make sense. Shadows in deep space aren't normally the primary tool for studying small bodies. Most comet analysis depends on emissions, infrared heat maps, polarization, and spectral composition. But on the night of December 17th into the early hours of December 18th, observatories in Chile, the Canary Islands, and Arizona noticed a strange rhythmic flicker when observing stars behind the path of 3I Atlas. These weren't distortions in the coma, they weren't caused by atmospheric turbulence. What researchers saw was a patterned oscillation in the occlusion, the very outline of 3I Atlas against the stars behind it. The effect was subtle but undeniable. The object's silhouette wasn't static. It was fluttering, shifting slightly from frame to frame, even when accounting for atmospheric distortion and telescope drift. The phenomenon repeated across independent facilities, all equipped with adaptive optics designed to compensate for Earth's atmosphere. The immediate assumption was rotation. Maybe 3I Atlas was spinning, causing a shift in its profile, but light curve analysis contradicted that. The nucleus's reflectivity remained consistent, suggesting a stable rotational period with no recent acceleration or wobble. So if it wasn't spinning faster, what was causing the shifting shape? Teams at the European Southern Observatory ran a comparative stack analysis, overlaying time-lapse images of the silhouette against the same star field. And that's when the real surprise emerged. The oscillation was directional. Instead of flickering randomly, the shadow seemed to breathe along a single axis, expanding and contracting laterally in precise rhythm. The timing matched exactly with the known period of jet synchronization observed by Stereo-A. Every 12.4 seconds, the outline flexed slightly, as if the object itself were expanding and contracting with each jet cycle. This is not something that comets do. Natural objects, especially porous, dusty ones, don't oscillate structurally without collapsing, and even if they could, they wouldn't do it on a regular, repeatable cycle. Yet here was 3I Atlas, clearly exhibiting synchronized shadow modulation, as if its internal structure or surface geometry was being reconfigured in real time. Further analysis offered two theories, both deeply unsettling. The first was the idea of dynamic shielding. Some researchers posited that the object might possess a layer, a membrane or external sheath, that reacts to thermal input or particle flux. This sheath could expand or contract to dissipate energy, causing the apparent oscillation. In theory, such a system would allow for active cooling or adaptive radiation control, but that requires a level of material sophistication that goes far beyond natural formation. The second theory was even more provocative: internal actuation. If the object was reorienting its internal mass, shifting material from one sector to another, like ballast tanks on a submarine, it could create slight changes in external shape that would affect the shadow signature. That would mean 3i Atlas isn't just stable, it's internally dynamic, able to reconfigure itself in ways no known celestial body can. But what made this discovery more compelling is what happened when the oscillation stopped. Around O3 UTC on December 18th, the shadow stabilized. The fluttering ceased. The outline returned to a clean, steady state. That moment coincided precisely with the final alignment of the anti-tail and the peak brightness of the sunward jet. In other words, when the maneuver ended, so did the breathing. This implied a goal, that the oscillation wasn't an uncontrolled symptom of thermal stress or material fatigue, but a process, a calculated time-bound operation that allowed the object to complete its redirection safely and efficiently. And for those watching from observatories under clear night skies, the message was chilling. We had just watched something adjust itself in space, not explode, not fragment, but reconfigure, live in front of our eyes, as if obeying a silent system we cannot see and barely understand. As Earth's telescopes caught the flickering shadow of 3i Atlas and its anti-tail completed its quiet, physics-defying flip, another data stream began telling a very different story. The thermal signature of the object was fading, fast. Infrared instruments aboard the James Webb Space Telescope had been locked onto 3i Atlas for days, gathering temperature data across the surface and coma. Its unique position away from Earth's atmosphere gave it an unparalleled view of the thermal behavior of celestial bodies. The expectation, based on years of cometary observation, was clear. As jet activity increased and the anti-tail reoriented, the surface temperature, especially near the active vents, should have risen, spiking with the intense energy required for sustained mass ejection. But that's not what the data showed. Instead, in the critical hours leading up to December 18th, the hottest regions on 3i Atlas's surface, previously concentrated near the sunward-facing pole, began to cool, not gradually, not evenly, but sharply. Within just 90 minutes, the surface temperature dropped by nearly 17% across a tightly clustered zone that had, just the day before, served as the origin point for the primary sunward jet. At the same time, a new hotspot began to emerge on the opposite hemisphere, cooler but rising steadily. Within 2 hours, it had overtaken the previous zone as the most thermally active region on the object. For a typical comet, this makes no sense. Thermal inertia, the tendency of heat to persist in a material, ensures that even after jets deactivate, the surrounding surface remains warm for hours. The heat doesn't just disappear, it bleeds outward, spreading across the porous, loosely packed matrix of ice and dust. Cooling takes time, but 3i Atlas didn't follow that script. Its heat map looked engineered, like energy had been shut off at one node and activated at another. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, thermal engineers began comparing the readings to heat dissipation curves from their spacecraft simulations. And an uncomfortable parallel emerged. The behavior of 3i Atlas's thermal profile mirrored that of radiator systems on artificial satellites, systems designed to dump heat in one direction while activating thrusters or electronics in another. One theory was that 3i Atlas contained high conductivity subsurface layers, capable of channeling heat internally and redistributing energy from one pole to another. But this would require materials with far greater thermal conductivity than porous ice or rocky dust. The models pointed to something more akin to carbon composites or metallized sheets, the kinds of materials used in spacecraft insulation. Adding to the mystery was the absence of thermal lag. In every known natural object, there's a delay between input and response, but here the temperature dropped almost simultaneously with the tail flip, and the new hotspot began warming even before the sun fully illuminated that region. This implied that the change wasn't driven by solar heating at all. The object was activating, internally. This was reinforced by data from the Spitzer successor array, which picked up mid-infrared emissions trailing just behind the object. It wasn't just cooling, it was shedding heat, deliberately. This is the behavior of a system that regulates its own energy budget, not one that is battered by solar wind and hoping to survive, but one that manages its exposure, controlling how and when energy is released. Some theorists called it a form of passive thermal regulation. Others went further, active modulation, implying that 3i Atlas wasn't just surviving the sun, It was using the sun. Even conservative observers admitted this couldn't be explained by simple outgassing. The heat signature told a story of internal processes, of chambers or layers transferring thermal loads like a spacecraft under maneuver. In the hours following the anti-tail flip, the thermal emissions dropped to baseline, almost too low for the level of activity being observed. The object was running cold, but still performing, and that perhaps was the most alien behavior of all, because in nature activity comes at a cost: heat, chaos, loss. But 3i Atlas, in the quiet glow of infrared, looked like something else entirely, a machine that had just cooled itself down before the real move began. Just as thermal emissions from 3i Atlas plummeted and its behavior grew more deliberate, another anomaly surfaced, this time far closer to home. Across a network of polar research stations, magnetometer arrays began recording short, sharp spikes in Earth's magnetic field. It started with a quiet blip over Troll Station in East Antarctica. At first, technicians thought it was equipment noise, a solar flare perhaps, or electromagnetic interference from nearby instruments. But within minutes, corresponding spikes were recorded at Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, Svalbard, and then Alert Station in the Canadian Arctic. The pattern was global. The spikes hit almost simultaneously, yet varied in amplitude depending on latitude. Normally, Earth's magnetosphere is stable, like a taut invisible net of field lines wrapping the planet. It's shaped by the constant interplay between the planet's core and the solar wind. When solar activity increases, the field can compress, stretch, or ripple. These deformations are well understood, but this wasn't solar interference. The solar wind was calm. No flares, no storms, no coronal mass ejections. GOES satellite data confirmed it. The geomagnetic conditions were classified as quiet, yet the field trembled as if responding to something else entirely. Timing became the most important clue. The first global magnetometer spike occurred 19 minutes after the anti-tail flip of 3i Atlas. The second, more powerful event occurred 38 minutes later, coinciding precisely with a directional shift in the object's inner jet, now pointing subtly off-axis, not directly at the Sun, but toward a spot on Earth's orbital path. The shape of these spikes was peculiar. They didn't resemble the long, smooth arcs typical of geomagnetic storms. Instead, they looked digital, sharp vertical climbs followed by plateaus and sudden drops, almost like signal pulses, the kind you might see from a transmitter. At the European Space Agency's Kiruna facility in Sweden, analysts mapped the data against historic magnetic disturbances. What they found was deeply unsettling. The signature matched a phenomenon observed only once before, in 2017 during the close passage of interstellar object Oumuamua. Back then, the spike had been dismissed as coincidental, but now, facing the same electromagnetic fingerprint during 3i Atlas's closest maneuver to Earth, the pattern became undeniable. These weren't noise patterns, they were emissions, and they weren't Earthborne. When a planetary magnetic field reacts, it's because something external is forcing alignment or disalignment of field lines. Normally that's solar wind. Occasionally it's a burst of gamma rays or a magnetopulse from deep space. But those phenomena have light-speed signals that arrive with high-energy counterparts, X-rays, UV bursts, plasma waves. None of that was detected here. Only the field moved, quietly, precisely, as though being shaped. More data arrived from the SuperMag global network, which monitors geomagnetic activity across hundreds of sensors worldwide. They confirmed the signal had a modulated rhythm, not chaotic, but oscillating. It seemed to repeat every 6 minutes, like a heartbeat. What made this chilling was that the oscillation wasn't random. It followed a binary structure, a long spike, 2 short, 1 medium, over and over, for more than an hour. Engineers at JPL jokingly dubbed it the Atlas Code, but the joke faded as senior scientists realized what this implied. An object over 100 million kilometers away was not just producing a jet, or an anti-tail, or even flipping thermal signatures. It was interacting with Earth's field, precisely enough to create measurable harmonics across the poles. How? One theory focused on electromagnetic plasma jets, a form of emission that carries magnetic fields through space, capable of twisting nearby fields like a rope pulled through water. If 3i Atlas was producing such a jet and directing it toward Earth, it could explain the synchronized distortion. But that would mean it was targeting Earth, not gravitationally, electromagnetically. And if that was true, the anti-tail flip wasn't just a solar maneuver, it was part of a calibration. After the magnetometer spikes shook confidence across observatories, another strange event unfolded, one that didn't involve signals, emissions, or instruments. It involved light, or rather, the absence of it. Over a 40-minute period, scientists at the Neumayer Thethur station in Antarctica reported something they couldn't explain. A localized, circular dimming of the horizon that moved against the normal arc of sunlight at that latitude. This was not a solar eclipse, nor a meteorological phenomenon like auroras, nor a passing cloud layer. This was something else entirely. They called it the polar shadow. Using time-lapse imagery and high-sensitivity contrast tools, researchers noticed a recurring darkening, perfectly rounded, like a lens-shaped dip in atmospheric light exposure. The shadow moved east to west instead of the usual west-to-east rotation that the Sun creates in polar regions, and as it passed, barometric pressure sensors and ground-level radiation counters fluctuated by small but measurable amounts. This wasn't a visual trick, it was real, and it was vast, stretching nearly 90 kilometers in diameter at ground level. But the most puzzling aspect was altitude. The shadow did not descend from space like a typical light-blocking object. It seemed to rise from the Earth, then arch upward, as though something invisible had passed between the planet and the Sun, creating an upward-facing cone of absence. Photometers showed light interference patterns that mimicked a lensing effect. That suggested some sort of refractive distortion in the atmosphere, something capable of subtly bending light away from the region, not just blocking it. The problem was, nothing in the sky was there to cause it, not even a dense cloud. The anomaly lasted precisely 7 minutes and 32 seconds, matching the second rhythmic cycle of the Atlas code identified in the magnetic pulses. At the same time, satellite-based infrared scans over the same Antarctic region showed a mild thermal dip, less than 1 degree Celsius, but rapid and focused. The dip reversed as quickly as it came. It was as if a cold veil had passed overhead without touching the surface. To observers, the phenomenon was almost spiritual, like a celestial hand had brushed the continent. But scientists knew better. The shape of the shadow, its upward orientation, and its perfect arc couldn't have been natural. Earth's atmospheric behaviors are turbulent, chaotic. They ripple, scatter, and dissolve. This shadow was engineered, sharp, deliberate. What kind of object could cause this? It had to be massless or near-transparent in the visible spectrum, but still capable of warping energy and light. Plasma, gas, a magnetic field boundary. The leading theory quickly emerged from an unexpected corner: space-based lensing phenomena, the same kind used in gravitational lensing to detect dark matter and far-off galaxies. But in this case, the lens wasn't gravity. It was magnetism and energy density, a bubble of distorted space, maybe created by the anti-tail jet's interaction with Earth's magnetosphere. If 3I Atlas had created such a bubble, it would mean the comet wasn't just emitting. It was actively altering the optical environment of Earth's sky, something only theoretical models of energy cloaking or artificial gravitational manipulation had ever proposed. This also aligned with a curious gap noticed by amateur astronomers in Argentina and South Africa. During the same 7-minute window, 3I Atlas temporarily disappeared from telescope tracking. It was still there, its coordinates unchanged, but it stopped reflecting light in the visible spectrum. Its brightness dropped to 0, as if it had gone cloaked. The timing was too perfect to dismiss. The anti-tail flip, the electromagnetic pulses, the rhythmic binary. And now, a moving lens-shaped shadow over the South Pole, all pointing to a larger pattern, a strategy unfolding in real time. The comet wasn't just approaching, it was testing, probing Earth's electromagnetic skin, gauging atmosphere, measuring light absorption, mapping field resistance, and the next maneuver would come at Earth's weakest point. Just after the polar shadow episode ended, analysts began connecting an unexpected series of real-time anomalies from Earth's upper atmosphere and magnetic field. What emerged wasn't just an isolated anomaly, it was a patterned corridor, running from one side of the planet to the other, cutting through the ionosphere like a scalpel. It started as a faint disturbance detected in South America, a momentary blister in the ionospheric plasma density above the Andes. At first it looked like a brief surge, possibly solar-related, but the data stream didn't match any current coronal mass ejection or geomagnetic storm. Then another disturbance bloomed, this time above the Atlantic, just north of the equator, followed by a third 30 minutes later, hovering over the Mediterranean. All these points connected in a line, like dots on a silent path across the Earth, and when mapped together, they formed a diagonal cut across the planet's electromagnetic field, a rift corridor slowly moving in sync with the rotational drift of 3I Atlas's anti-tail. Scientists at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, who had been quietly building a magnetic interference model based on the comet's increasing influence, ran a simulation. The results were disturbing. This corridor, stretching over 6,000 miles, aligned precisely with the secondary harmonic resonance of the anti-tail's new rotational axis. In layman's terms, the flipped tail wasn't random. It was now pointing a magnetic line directly at Earth, and Earth was responding by creating invisible rips in its own electromagnetic cloak. This was unprecedented. Not even the most violent solar storms in recorded history, not the Carrington event, not even the Halloween storms of 2003, had caused linear coordinated weakening zones across the entire ionosphere. One researcher described it like this: "It's not a hit, it's a handshake." The comet's field was resonating with Earth's in such a way that the planet's magnetic defenses weren't being smashed. They were being subtly bypassed, like a radio signal tuning into a frequency that lets it slip through barriers undetected. And there was more. As this corridor expanded, it began showing effects on atmospheric radar systems. In Brazil and over parts of northern Africa, long-range radar stations lost signal integrity. Planes flying overhead experienced temporary altitude discrepancies, with instruments showing sudden changes in vertical speed that didn't exist. This wasn't just invisible, it was manipulative. Something was using the flipped anti-tail not as a weapon, but as a channel, an invisible bridge or pipeline, testing how much could pass through Earth's field without resistance. At the same time, the temperature in the upper thermosphere dipped slightly across the corridor's width. Not enough to affect surface weather, but just enough to mark the passage of an unknown field, one that for now seemed more curious than hostile. Then came the final detail, a gravitational hiccup. Sensitive laser interferometers, including those at LIGO and Virgo, detected a microdilation event, a tiny stretching of space-time in a straight line that mirrored the corridor's path. Too small to indicate a gravitational wave from a supernova or black hole, but far too precise to be random. Something had moved through that corridor, or perhaps more, accurately. Something had pulled space open along it. And that's when a new question emerged. What if the anti-tail flip wasn't defensive? What if it was alignment? What if, in flipping itself, 3I Atlas wasn't escaping the sun's gravity, but repositioning its tail, its energy system, to align perfectly with Earth's magnetic resonance channels, to test communication, or worse, to initiate delivery? While the electromagnetic corridor mapped across the upper atmosphere raised alarms, what came next shattered the illusion that 3I Atlas's influence was confined to the skies. In the early morning hours, scientists at a European geophysics lab based in southern Spain activated a series of ground-penetrating radar arrays to study seismic stability beneath the Mediterranean basin. What they found had nothing to do with tectonics. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, far beyond the crust, where radar signals rarely return usable echoes, a waveform pattern was detected. It was faint at first, but over several hours it began to build, repeating with eerie regularity. It was not seismic, it was not electrical, it was geometric. The waveform echoed the corridor that had just formed in the skies above. Same angle, same frequency spacing, same resonance timing. But this time the disturbance was embedded within the mantle's mineral layers, not drifting like a tectonic tremor, but standing still, as if etched into the stone beneath us. Scientists described it as a radial harmonic shell. In simpler terms, a vibration so perfectly symmetrical that it wrapped the Earth's interior like a bell's tone caught in freeze frame. It didn't move outward like a ripple, it just vibrated in place, held by some external force. The epicenter? A point of convergence located beneath the intersection of three landmasses, Algeria, Italy and Greece. Coincidentally or not, This area aligned perfectly with the central crossing node of the magnetic corridor in Earth's atmosphere, as described in Chapter 10. It was as if the energy moving through the anti-tail had not only passed through Earth's magnetic shielding, but had anchored itself into the very bones of the planet. That's when a second signal was discovered, this time from China. In the deserts of Xinjiang, a military-operated geological monitoring station equipped with deep-bore acoustic sensors had picked up a subaudible hum, not from the Earth's crust, but from the cavity beneath it. This hum was consistent, layered, and possessed harmonic intervals far too structured to be natural. According to the report, the vibration felt almost synthetic, like a resonator being pulsed by an intelligence testing frequency boundaries. To confirm the phenomenon, a cross-check was initiated between independent stations across the globe, from Antarctica's seismic arrays to South Korea's volcanic monitoring network. All heard the same hum. Each waveform was timed precisely with the corridor's magnetic pulses, and when overlaid, the signals formed a perfect mirror image of the anti-tail's spiraling telemetry, as seen from deep space probes earlier that morning. That was the breaking point. This wasn't an effect. This wasn't a side reaction. Earth was participating. Something within the planet was being activated, tuned, or triggered by the comet's flipped anti-tail. Theories exploded across secure networks. One astrophysicist asked the unthinkable, what if Earth isn't just reacting? What if it's been waiting? He referenced the possibility that certain geological cavities might be natural resonance chambers, not random, but positioned by the planet's own architecture over billions of years. And now something had found their frequency, something external. 3I Atlas, a comet, a construct, or perhaps a key. All of this culminated in a final moment of realization. The flipped anti-tail wasn't just pointing at Earth, it was interacting with it. And the Earth, its fields, its minerals, its harmonic core, was responding, not with fear, not with resistance, but with openness. Which brings us to the next revelation, when ocean-based sensors in the Pacific detect a simultaneous displacement in deep water pressure levels at exactly the same frequency. The moment the Earth's subsurface echoed with harmonic resonance, scientists turned their attention to the largest and least understood resonator on the planet, the oceans. Covering more than 70% of Earth's surface, the oceans are not just passive bodies of water, they're dynamic, conductive, and sensitive to even the subtlest shifts in planetary magnetism and atmospheric pressure. At 0518 UTC, a sequence of anomalies was registered across the Deep Argo network, an array of autonomous oceanic probes designed to monitor temperature, salinity, and pressure at extreme depths. These probes are designed to dive as far as 6,000 meters beneath the surface, returning real-time data to satellites. On that morning, over a dozen probes, spanning locations from the Mariana Trench to the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, registered sudden vertical displacements, not from tectonic activity, not from underwater landslides, but from pressure shifts that followed the same pulse interval as the flipped anti-tail's broadcasted telemetry. The data was unmistakable, a pattern of rise and fall motion synced to a 93-second interval, stretching across vast regions of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It was as if something was tugging gently at the water columns, not from within the Earth, but from above or beyond. What made this more disturbing was the symmetry. Each displacement occurred at mirrored locations across hemispheres. A spike in the South Pacific matched a dip in the North Atlantic. A surge near Indonesia mirrored a withdrawal off the coast of Chile. The ocean was responding like a liquid drum, resonating with an external rhythm that no natural force had ever created, at least not in recorded human history. This wasn't the tide. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the moon. It was something else. Naval monitoring systems, designed to detect submarine activity and undersea volcanic eruptions, were also triggered. But no vessels were found. No eruptions were detected. The sensors were being tripped by a non-mechanical, non-seismic and utterly alien signal moving through water. At the same time, marine biologists in Australia and Japan reported something strange among deep-dwelling sea life. In aquariums and open ocean studies, several species of cephalopods, known for their sensitivity to magnetic fields, began clustering together in behavior that resembled electromagnetic shielding. They would form spirals or circles and remain motionless, an act scientists had never observed outside of catastrophic pressure changes during storms or quakes. But there were no quakes, no storms, just silence, and a pulsing wave moving through water. To understand how such a signal could pass through the ocean with such precision, researchers began mapping the pattern onto known seafloor structures. What they discovered echoed the realization from Chapter 11. The displacement path followed a geometric trajectory, connecting seamount chains, mid-ocean ridges, and ancient submerged trenches in a sequence that mirrored the spiral shape of the anti-tail. It was like the oceans themselves were programmed to respond. One geophysicist at Woods Hole put it bluntly, "If the Earth is a bell, then the ocean is its skin." And this morning something struck it, gently, repeatedly, and it rang. That metaphor would have been poetic, if not for what came next. For at precisely 0602 UTC, satellite imagery captured a sudden brightening in the green band spectrum just above a mid-Pacific trench. A flash. Brief, contained, and completely unconnected to any known military or natural phenomenon. When reanalyzed using thermal filters, the flash appeared to form a ripple ring in the atmosphere above the location, corresponding exactly to the next pulse of 3I Atlas's anti-tail. Which raises a disturbing possibility. The oceans aren't just echoing a signal, they're amplifying it, and whatever is sending it may be using the ocean as a global conduit. As scientists tracked the ripple from the oceans into the sky, the air above Earth, once considered a buffer, a shield, began to exhibit behaviors that no one could fully explain. What started as a series of harmonic pulses underwater was now climbing into the upper layers of the atmosphere, and with it came a rearrangement of Earth's invisible energy flows. By 0612 UTC, high-altitude balloons launched from Ecuador and Kenya, equatorial vantage points typically used to monitor atmospheric currents, detected something previously uncharted, a slow-forming spiral rotation in the mesosphere. The phenomenon wasn't a typical cyclone. There was no accompanying low-pressure center, no moisture, and no rotational chaos. Instead, it was a structured spiral of ionized particles circling in silence. This spiral wasn't just a visual oddity, it was magnetically aligned. When researchers overlaid the spiral's structure onto magnetosphere data from the European Space Agency's swarm satellites, the match was uncanny. The spiral in the atmosphere followed the same angles of inclination as Earth's magnetic field lines, particularly those now bending slightly toward the trajectory of 3I Atlas's anti-tail. One could almost visualize the Earth's protective layers twisting in sync with the object now less than 24 hours away. Even more chilling was what the data showed next, a measurable drop in ultraviolet, UV radiation above the spiral zone. Typically, this region of the atmosphere is exposed to intense solar radiation, filtered by the ozone layer below. But between 0615 and 0622 UTC, sensors aboard the monitoring balloons recorded a 32% decrease in UV flux. It wasn't due to cloud coverage or solar output. It was as if the UV was being absorbed or redirected, not blocked by clouds, but by something invisible in the air itself. At ground level, nothing seemed unusual. The skies were clear in both Quito and Nairobi, but above them, at altitudes exceeding 50 kilometers, the atmosphere was behaving like a lens, not a shield. A lens focusing or diffusing energy based on an unknown alignment. This was not a coincidence. Remember the spiral formation detected within the anti-tail during its optical flip? The same rotational geometry was now unfolding in the upper atmosphere. The timeline matched, the structure matched, and even the resonance frequency of the pulses observed from Earth's oceans matched the rotational rate of the spiral's bands as seen from above. This was not the weather. This was not the solar wind. This was not interference. It was a direct correlation between an incoming interstellar object and the shape of the sky itself. To explore this further, researchers simulated how Earth's magnetosphere would respond if bombarded by symmetrical electromagnetic pulses from a near-Earth comet. The results were stunning. Under certain field strengths, the simulated magnetosphere began to produce harmonic nodes, where particles and fields naturally aligned into vortex shapes, mimicking what was now being observed above the equator. In essence, the Earth was becoming a reactive shell, a system not just resisting external influence but synchronizing with it. Theories began to circulate, Not in public press briefings, but in private chat rooms and encrypted academic message boards. Some speculated that the anti-tail of 3I Atlas wasn't merely ejecting material, but was stimulating a response in Earth's magnetic environment, like a tuning fork causing another to vibrate without direct contact. If this is true, the implications are profound. It suggests that 3I Atlas is not just influencing the solar system with its trajectory, but selectively activating responses on Earth, water, air, field, all resonating. By the time Earth's upper atmosphere began spiralling in resonance with 3I Atlas's anti-tail, attention turned toward the poles. For centuries, auroras have danced across the night skies of the Arctic and Antarctic, flickering with colour, moving in unpredictable waves as solar particles crash into Earth's magnetic field. But on the night of December 18th, something changed. At 07:02 UTC, high-resolution satellite footage from NOAA's polar orbiting environmental satellites began capturing a phenomenon that was at first dismissed as a sensor artifact. Auroral bands that had stopped flickering. Instead of flowing ribbons, the auroras, both Aurora Borealis and Aurora Australis, were forming rigid arcs, perfectly circular, locked into place as though someone had drawn them with a compass across the top and bottom of the Earth. This wasn't just atmospheric coincidence. It was a magnetic freeze. The natural chaos of the aurora depends on particle collisions, electrons and protons slamming into oxygen and nitrogen atoms to create brief explosions of light. But in this moment, collisions appeared to be coordinated, a visual rhythm. The light pulses became evenly spaced, the wavelengths uniform. Spectral analysis showed fewer colour shifts and more narrowband emissions, a signature typically only seen in laser-driven plasmas. In other words, the auroras weren't just reacting to solar energy, they were amplifying a pattern. That pattern matched the last detected emission arc from the anti-tail of 3I Atlas, observed 21 hours earlier by Japan's JAXA XUV tracking array. The arc formed a faint crescent of energized particles that had split into two distinct wavefronts, one heading toward the Moon, the other curling along Earth's orbital path. Now the auroras reflected the same symmetry, a near-perfect match in curvature and angle. To most observers on the ground, the auroras looked mesmerizing but harmless. In places like northern Canada, Iceland and New Zealand, photographers posted images of the eerie frozen waves stretching across the sky. But what they didn't realize is that those waves were not random. They were aligned with something far larger. Scientists began to suspect that Earth's poles were being used as receivers, not metaphorically, but electromagnetically. Think of the polar regions as the terminals of a tuning circuit. With the atmosphere spiraling, the oceans pulsing, and now the auroras locking into precision, Earth was behaving like a giant resonator. One physicist from the University of Tromsø noted that the auroral freeze resembled what happens when a magnetic field is driven into resonant saturation. That is, when a field is pulsed at exactly the frequency it naturally prefers, it can stand still while still being active, a kind of magnetic hypnosis. That's what was happening now. The anti-tail of 3I Atlas had, in some way, either directly or indirectly triggered harmonic feedback across Earth's magnetic poles. This wasn't the result of impact or collision or solar wind. It was the result of alignment with an object not of this solar system. Even more astonishing, measurements from the SuperDARN radar network revealed that ionospheric plasma drift, normally random and chaotic, had settled into an almost perfect circular motion around each pole. These weren't weather systems, these were field structures, geometries emerging from a resonance that Earth had not experienced in any known historical cycle. This raises an unsettling question. If Earth is reacting so precisely to the patterns coming off 3I Atlas, is this object broadcasting something? Is the anti-tail not just a trail of gas and dust, but a waveguide, intentionally shaped to produce planetary alignment? The silence from space agencies grew louder. No briefings were issued, no clarifications made. By the time Earth's upper atmosphere began spiraling in resonance with 3I Atlas's anti-tail, attention turned toward the poles. For centuries, auroras have danced across the night skies of the Arctic and Antarctic, flickering with colour, moving in unpredictable waves as solar particles crash into Earth's magnetic field. But on the night of December 18th, something changed. At 7:02 UTC, high-resolution satellite footage from NOAA's polar orbiting environmental satellites began capturing a phenomenon that was at first dismissed as a sensor artifact: auroral bands that had stopped flickering. Instead of flowing ribbons, the auroras, both Aurora Borealis and Aurora Australis, were forming rigid arcs, perfectly circular, locked into place as though someone had drawn them with a compass across the top and bottom of the Earth. This wasn't just atmospheric coincidence, it was a magnetic freeze. The natural chaos of the aurora depends on particle collisions, electrons and protons slamming into oxygen and nitrogen atoms to create brief explosions of light. But in this moment, collisions appeared to be coordinated, a visual rhythm. The light pulses became evenly spaced, the wavelengths uniform. Spectral analysis showed fewer colour shifts and more narrowband emissions, a signature typically only seen in laser-driven plasmas. In other words, the auroras weren't just reacting to solar energy, they were amplifying a pattern. That pattern matched the last detected emission arc from the anti-tail of 3I Atlas, observed 21 hours earlier by Japan's JAXA XUV tracking array. The arc formed a faint crescent of energized particles that had split into two distinct wavefronts, one heading toward the Moon, the other curling along Earth's orbital path. Now, the auroras reflected the same symmetry, a near-perfect match in curvature and angle. To most observers on the ground, the auroras looked mesmerizing but harmless. In places like northern Canada, Iceland and New Zealand, photographers posted images of the eerie, frozen waves stretching across the sky. But what they didn't realize is that those waves were not random. They were aligned with something far larger. Scientists began to suspect that Earth's poles were being used as receivers, not metaphorically, but electromagnetically. Think of the polar regions as the terminals of a tuning circuit. With the atmosphere spiraling, the oceans pulsing, and now the auroras locking into precision, Earth was behaving like a giant resonator. One physicist from the University of Tromsø noted that the auroral freeze resembled what happens when a magnetic field is driven into resonant saturation. That is, when a field is pulsed at exactly the frequency it naturally prefers, it can stand still while still being active, a kind of magnetic hypnosis. That's what was happening now. The anti-tail of 3I Atlas had, in some way, either directly or indirectly triggered harmonic feedback across Earth's magnetic poles. This wasn't the result of impact or collision or solar wind. It was the result of alignment with an object not of this solar system. Even more astonishing, measurements from the SuperDARN radar network revealed that ionospheric plasma drift, normally random and chaotic, had settled into an almost perfect circular motion around each pole. These weren't weather systems, these were field structures, geometries emerging from a resonance that Earth had not experienced in any known historical cycle. This raises an unsettling question. If Earth is reacting so precisely to the patterns coming off 3I Atlas, is this object broadcasting something? Is the anti-tail not just a trail of gas and dust, but a waveguide, intentionally shaped to produce planetary alignment? The silence from space agencies grew louder. No briefings were issued, no clarifications made. Just after Earth's radiation belts began broadcasting their strange harmonic pulses into space, attention shifted to a growing anomaly in satellite behavior, specifically those orbiting above the Van Allen belts. These aren't your typical communication satellites. They include deep space relay systems, military-grade GPS assets, weather forecasting arrays, and scientific instruments that monitor solar activity from a safe distance. And almost all of them began to exhibit the same issue: synchronization drift. At first, it appeared subtle. The GPS timestamps transmitted by several US and European satellites were suddenly off by a fraction of a second. Then came minor attitude adjustments that weren't part of scheduled thruster burns. Onboard logs showed that some satellite gyroscopes had registered brief but sharp spikes in rotational speed, yet their systems reported no mechanical movement. It was like the satellites were tuning themselves, but to what? NASA's Deep Space Network was the first to cross-verify the data. Their signal analysts noticed that across a dozen different spacecraft, some orbiting the Moon, others in Lagrange point positions, the same pattern emerged. Core systems were being recalibrated, not by their operators, but by an external influence acting on their inertial sensors and atomic clocks. The culprit was the same frequency discovered in Chapter 15, the 11-minute 20-second magnetic pulse emerging from Earth itself. The belts had been broadcasting it. Now satellites were listening to it and adjusting themselves in response. But why would an object in space, designed to be stable, isolated and hardened against external interference, respond to a signal like this? Because the signal wasn't random. It mirrored the behavior of a calibration beacon. In satellite design, calibration beacons are used to help synchronize systems across fleets. They operate at predictable intervals, contain timing data, and allow distant spacecraft to align their navigation and communication protocols. The magnetic pulses from Earth matched the structure of such a beacon, but were tens of thousands of times stronger and carried non-Earth signatures. This raises a profound possibility. Earth had begun emitting a signal that mimicked the behavior of a galactic positioning system, but one that doesn't originate from Earth's technology. It originated from 3I Atlas. By manipulating Earth's electromagnetic shields, the object had essentially turned our planet into a broadcasting node, a relay in some unknown network, and now satellites, built to detect synchronization pulses, were unknowingly aligning themselves with this new signal. A system built for precision had become a receiver for distortion. One spacecraft, the Japanese Hisaki telescope, which monitors planetary atmospheres, began sending corrupted telemetry data back to Earth. Strangely, the errors weren't random. The corrupted segments repeated every 11 minutes and included recurring binary-like structures. Another satellite, ESA's Cluster 2, began drifting slightly out of its normal orbit pattern, only to snap back as if nudged by an unseen hand. Engineers thought it was a software bug, until they found that its gyroscopes had briefly switched modes without human command. The change coincided exactly with one of the Earth-emitted magnetic pulses. To make things even stranger, several CubeSats in low Earth orbit, typically noisy and unreliable, began behaving in perfect harmony, syncing their data transmissions and rotating in patterns that formed geometric alignments when plotted in 3D space. These were craft from different countries, with different missions and no shared control protocol. And yet, for 1 hour, they behaved as if choreographed by a single mind. None of this triggered collision protocols. None of it was flagged as sabotage, because nothing technically broke. Instead, something changed. The way these machines understood where they were and what they were connected to. As machines across orbit began to subtly synchronize with the magnetic pulses emerging from Earth's radiation belts, pulses structured with the precision of galactic calibration beacons, researchers started to notice something even more disturbing. Humans were responding too, not in overt or visible ways at first, but in laboratories across the world, particularly those monitoring circadian rhythms, heart rate variability and neural activity. Anomalies started creeping into the data. And just like with the satellites, it wasn't chaos, it was structure. At a sleep lab in Germany, participants involved in long-term circadian studies suddenly began drifting into REM sleep phases exactly 11 minutes and 20 seconds after laying down, regardless of their prior schedule or the experimental conditions set by the researchers. It happened across unrelated individuals, all in different light settings, with no shared stimuli. The odds of that alignment occurring by chance were effectively zero. In Chile, an observatory medical team noticed a strange pattern in their own staff's heartbeat rhythms during long night shifts. Wearable biometric devices showed synchronized drops in heart rate, followed by brief but measurable increases in neural alertness, again precisely spaced by that same 11-minute interval. Then came the wave of unexplained migraines and tinnitus reported by air traffic controllers, satellite operators, and deep space observatory staff, specifically those working in magnetically shielded rooms. Normally, such environments are designed to block external EM interference, yet somehow these individuals were the first to complain of pressure in the skull, phantom vibrations and auditory hallucinations of distant pulsing. Medical scans revealed no damage, but EEG readings told a different story. Some of these individuals had begun producing synchronized theta wave bursts every 11 minutes. Signals typically associated with deep meditation or dream states, not waking concentration. These weren't random spikes. They matched the exact same interval as the magnetic pulses now echoing through the Van Allen belts. It was as if a portion of the population had been quietly recruited into a global rhythm. A heartbeat, not of Earth, but of something that now pulsed through it. This revelation sent shockwaves through agencies not typically aligned. NASA, ESA, JAXA, and even DARPA held closed-door calls that, according to leaked notes, centered on one growing fear. What if biological synchronization is only the first step? A confidential report from a Scandinavian research group working under military funding added fuel to the fire. Using high-sensitivity magnetic resonance scans, they tested a theory that certain brain regions, particularly the pineal gland, might be acting like antennae, tuned not just to Earth's magnetic field, but to whatever. Modulation had now been introduced by 3i Atlas. Their results were deeply unsettling. Not only did the pineal region show hyperactivation in test subjects exposed to artificial recreations of the Earth pulse, but in a few participants there was a secondary response, a brief synchronization with non-terrestrial frequency bands, frequencies that matched none of Earth's natural background radiation. These weren't just magnetic. They were information-dense, possibly encoded. In short, the brain wasn't just reacting, it was decoding something, and it wasn't alone. A neurobiology team in California, reviewing hundreds of hours of EEG footage from sleep studies dating back a decade, found dormant fragments of this 11-minute cycle appearing before the object known as 3i Atlas even entered the solar system. Like a ghost signal, scattered across time, waiting for something to amplify it. Now, with Earth transformed into a synchronized transmission node, it was no longer a ghost, it was waking up. But here's the most terrifying realization yet. 3i Atlas didn't need to physically contact Earth. It had already entered us using light, magnetism, and rhythm. And if synchronization was spreading from orbit to biology, as the final pieces began falling into place, a chilling new hypothesis surfaced among interdisciplinary teams working across quantum physics, planetary magnetism, and neural network theory. What if Earth wasn't just reacting to 3i Atlas, but had always been part of its intended architecture? For weeks, scientists had been trying to decode the patterns in the magnetic pulses, the anti-tail flip, and the synchronization of orbital systems. But it was a lone acoustics researcher from Norway, working on bioresonance studies, who made a subtle yet profound observation. The pulses weren't random fluctuations or directional signals, they were musical. Not in the traditional sense, but in the physics of harmonic structure. The intervals followed precise mathematical ratios that mimic chords, intervals, and resonance bands known to generate vibratory coherence in complex systems. It was like listening to a tuning fork being struck from orbit, and watching Earth respond in harmony. Earth's ionosphere, magnetosphere, oceanic tides, and now even biological rhythms were synchronizing not just in timing, but in frequency alignment. The planet itself was acting like a giant resonating chamber. And that changed everything. What if 3i Atlas wasn't broadcasting? What if it was playing? Not like a musician, but like a conductor awakening an instrument that had been silent for too long. The Earth, its magnetic layers, oceans, crust, ionosphere, and species, wasn't just a host. It was a resonance body. This theory gained traction when teams at the European Southern Observatory began mapping the subharmonics of recent geomagnetic activity against acoustic data from deep Earth listening stations. What they found was a recurring pattern. Every time 3i Atlas emitted a new harmonic jet from its anti-tail, a measurable echo followed inside Earth's crust, as if the signal was being received and absorbed into the lithosphere. These weren't typical tectonic tremors or magnetospheric storms. They were harmonic responses, precisely timed, mirroring the input signal with phase shift and delay that matched acoustic resonance models. The Earth was replying. That would explain the inexplicable rise in low-frequency atmospheric pressure waves, detected not only in polar regions but along the equator. These waves had been misclassified as turbulence or climate anomalies. But now, in this new model, they were the equivalent of feedback loops, the sound of a struck object ringing back into the cosmos. And that brings us to the deepest question of all. If 3i Atlas was designed to play a planet, who designed the score? It couldn't be chance. The structure of the signals, the ratios of interval spacing, the biological compatibility, everything hinted at deliberate intention, not random collision. This wasn't the aftermath of some ancient rogue object stumbling through space. This was an engineered interaction, one where Earth was the device, and 3I Atlas the key. There was no explosion, no impact, no invasion, just a shift, a realignment so profound that every sensitive system on the planet, natural or synthetic, was now entangled in a single slow-moving signal cascade that had no precedent in modern science. And yet, it all made a strange kind of sense. Throughout history, from ancient temples aligned to magnetic north, to biological rhythms dictated by lunar cycles, to the spontaneous emergence of harmonic frequencies in neural communication, Earth had always responded to external rhythms. What changed was that this time, the rhythm had purpose. In this new light, the anti-tail flip wasn't just a physical event, it was the opening note in a symphony that used a planet as its orchestra. If Earth was indeed the instrument, a chilling thought began to take hold among the few who dared to follow this line of logic to its end. Someone, or something, must be listening. This wasn't just a comet reacting to gravity wells or solar winds. 3I Atlas had displayed patterned behavior, predictive synchronization, and now, with the anti-tail flip aligned to Earth's resonance bands, it was effectively conducting a signal that could only be meant to travel outward. But outward to where? Space agencies, intelligence analysts, and deep space listening stations began coordinating, quietly, looking for anomalies. Not in the object, but in the reaction of deep space itself. What they were searching for wasn't just another comet or asteroid. They were scanning for a listener, something capable of interpreting the energy wave that 3I Atlas and Earth had just begun transmitting together. It started in silence. Then, on the morning of December 18th, synchronized, pulses were picked up across multiple radio bands, not from Earth, but from deep space relays placed millions of miles out, probes and telescopes designed to detect background noise from the cosmic microwave radiation field. These weren't Earth-generated echoes. They were reflected responses, as if the combined harmonic being generated between Earth and 3I Atlas had found a mirror. At first, scientists thought it could be a natural rebound, ionized particles creating ghost signals, but these pulses had signature decay curves that were too clean, too regular, and repeating in triplet clusters. Triplets that matched a structure known in signal theory as handshakes. Handshake signals are common in artificial communications. Satellites do it, probes do it. Even human-built deep space devices perform handshakes to confirm alignment. This wasn't noise. This was acknowledgement. What shook the research community most was where the return pulses were detected from. They weren't from a planetary body. They weren't from a fixed location in any known star system. They came from nothing. A cold, empty vector deep in the direction of intergalactic void space, where no known object exists. And yet, something was there. The European Space Agency's triangulation network logged at least 7 handshake-like signals in the span of 1 hour, each more refined than the last. The delay between send and receive was consistent with a point roughly 12 billion miles away, far outside the heliopause. But the most disturbing part, each returning signal was slightly more complex than the one before it. This suggested more than just a passive bounce back. It suggested interpretation, response, escalation. It meant 3I Atlas didn't just awaken Earth's resonance. It triggered a conversation that Earth had been unknowingly prepared for, its crust layered with conductive minerals, its magnetic field acting as an amplifier, its oceans carrying low-frequency signals like one massive subwoofer in space. And now, with the anti-tail flipped and aligned to this sequence, Earth and 3I Atlas weren't just participants. They were the opening act in a signal chain meant to travel vast distances. But for what purpose? Was this a beacon to an ancient builder race? Was Earth part of an experimental array? Or was this all just an elaborate cosmic test, a trigger embedded in 3I Atlas, waiting to align with a planetary configuration to reveal who's still out there? What we do know is this. Since the moment the anti-tail flipped and the Earth's harmonics began to shift, the silence of deep space has not been silent. We are not just looking at a comet anymore. We're looking into a mirror, and something just blinked. The moment Earth's instruments logged the final returning triplet signal from the outer void, everything shifted. Not because the world changed physically, but because it had crossed an invisible threshold. In military terms, this is called a response window. a critical time period in which, after an initial contact or warning, the expected reaction is supposed to arrive, whether it's an enemy counterstrike, a diplomatic reply, or, if you're facing the unknown, a presence revealing itself. For decades, radio telescopes and exoplanet researchers had theorized about this kind of scenario. What would happen if we finally got a signal back? Would it be instantaneous? Would it be encrypted? Would it be benign? But this was different. We didn't send a message. We became one. 3i Atlas didn't emit a narrowband transmission or a coded radio ping. It aligned itself with Earth to trigger something deeper, a planetary frequency cascade, and now that signal had been heard. The analysts were divided. Some believed the return signal was just an echo. Others said it was proof of external intelligence. But a small group of astrophysicists, signal theorists, and military observers, those who had watched 3i Atlas evolve from its first appearance, were convinced of something else entirely. The signal wasn't just acknowledged, it was accepted, which means the response window had already started. This triggered a flurry of silent movements within observatories and command centres. Not because the sky had suddenly changed, but because for the first time, space wasn't just being observed, it was observing back. NASA's Deep Space Network in California, the Chinese Fast Array, and a series of independent telescopes in Chile and South Africa all began to lock onto the source vector. They weren't expecting to see a spaceship or blinking lights. What they were trying to detect was movement. Anything. Even a gravity ripple. And just after the last handshake signal decayed, that ripple came. Not in the form of a shock wave or particle burst, but as a mass displacement shadow. A distortion, far beyond Neptune's orbit, moving through the void without emission, without heat, and without light, but with mass. It was as if something had begun sliding across the edge of space-time, dragging reality along with it. The gravitational lensing showed a warp, a localized bulge where the background starlight twisted and shifted unnaturally. And it was heading in our direction. No trajectory, no propulsion, just an inevitable drift. Some theorized this was a natural consequence of 3i Atlas's activation, a kind of beacon triggering another object to awaken. Others believed it was the arrival of something older, something that had been waiting. But the key factor was timing. The gravitational ripple was calculated to arrive at the edge of the inner solar system within 24 hours of 3i Atlas's anti-tail alignment, almost as if the comet had flipped its tail not just to signal Earth, but to hand off the stage to something else entirely, something that had been listening and now was responding. This created a chilling scenario. If this was a probe, or a vessel, or even a mass-driven intelligence, then the Earth was no longer just a point on a map. It was now part of the system, a relay node, a starting key, or worse, a test site. What worried the quiet circles most was the lack of any further signal. No confirmation, no handshake, just silence. Because in space, silence after a response window isn't peace. It's the final calm before contact. For centuries, humanity has looked up at the stars and imagined itself at the center of the cosmic question, are we alone? But what the final anti-tail reversal of 3i Atlas forced us to confront was something far more unsettling. What if we were never alone, only uninvited? Because for the first time, Earth didn't just detect something extraordinary, it participated. Unwittingly, instinctively, reactively, but undeniably. When the gravitational distortion following 3i Atlas began to move toward the solar system, the very fabric of what scientists thought they understood about cosmic structure began to fray. And it wasn't because of its mass. It wasn't even because of its trajectory. It was because of its behavior. The object, if it can even be called that, was responding to timing, not random movement, not orbital decay, but timed entry. It was as if 3i Atlas had flipped its anti-tail, not just as a byproduct of physics, but as a signal, and in response the next entity in the sequence had begun its approach. This begged a terrifying question that agencies around the globe began whispering into encrypted channels. Is Earth part of a system we never knew existed? A cosmic relay? A chain of handoffs, where one object primes the next, and each activation is part of a greater pattern, one not designed for our understanding, but perhaps for something far older, far more deliberate. If this was a pattern, then Earth was now a node. And nodes, in any system can be activated. That's where the tension began to shift, from wonder to preparation. Not military preparation, not in the traditional sense, but cognitive readiness, acknowledgement, the realization that Earth might not just be being visited, it might be functioning, responding, and worst of all, it might be irreversibly linked. Some scientists at the European Southern Observatory began cross-referencing 3I Atlas's movements with ancient star maps, looking for precedents, previous objects that might have played a similar role, left similar marks. What they found wasn't a clean match, but a pattern of alignments. Every few thousand years, an object, always unique, always strange, passes close to Earth, leaves confusion in its wake, and disappears. But 3 Atlas had done something none of them had done. It communicated, not with language, not with light, but with motion, and it triggered a response. That meant Earth was no longer an observer. It was now a participant in a conversation it never started. And the terrifying part, we don't know what we agreed to, because if 3I Atlas passed a message along, if it flipped its tail to point us out like a lighthouse beam catching a ship's attention, then the next movement isn't about discovery, it's about delivery. Whether it's data, energy, physical material, or something less tangible, the systems we're seeing now resemble the early stages of activation, an unlocking process. One piece completes, and the next begins. And as Earth sits in the crosshairs of this invisible exchange, we must ask a question far beyond astrophysics. What is our role in this chain? Are we a recipient, a conduit, or something else entirely? What if humanity was never meant to know about the chain, only serve a function inside it? As more space agencies go silent and the data stream narrows to only the most guarded nodes, it's becoming clear that whatever Earth has become, it's not accidental. The moment came quietly, no explosion, no broadcast, no fireworks in the sky, just a subtle shift, so faint that only the deepest sensing observatories caught it in real time. At exactly 4:13 in the morning UTC, on December 18th, 3 Atlas released a final flicker from its anti-tail, a pulse, barely above background radiation, carried on a frequency band that doesn't align with any known natural emission. It wasn't a burst. It wasn't a flare. It was a confirmation. Every chapter of this story has led here, to the point where speculation breaks, and clarity, however strange, begins to rise through the fog. The anti-tail didn't just flip directionally, it functionally reversed. Instead of shedding, it began absorbing. Light, plasma, even particulate solar wind. Every camera aimed at the comet watched in disbelief as the tail, instead of streaming outward from solar pressure, began folding inward, coiling like a whip tightening around the nucleus. It was behaving like a sensor closing, like a seal forming, like something was being stored, contained, or protected, and then all motion froze, not slowed, not decayed, stopped. The jets ceased. The rotational wobble that had defined its erratic spin for months suddenly smoothed into perfect symmetry. Even the oscillating electromagnetic interference that had been saturating deep space telemetry lines went silent. It was as if the object had entered hibernation. But why? And why now? Just 24 hours before its closest approach to Earth. The leading theory isn't comforting. A combined paper released jointly by astrophysicists in Canada, India and Norway laid it out with careful phrasing, but no effort to soften the blow. 3. Atlas is preparing for a secondary phase of functionality. The anti-tail reversal marks the end of transmission and the beginning of reception. This is no longer a comet. It is a relay device. Earth is its target. That idea, one which just weeks ago would have sounded ridiculous, now feels undeniable. Everything 3I Atlas has done since its first appearance has mirrored the stages of an engineered protocol: observation, adjustment, energy intake, orientation, communication, and now, transition. It didn't come to crash, it didn't come to vanish, it came to signal, and the signal is complete. The anti-tail, now fully collapsed into its structure, has created what appears to be a closed-loop magnetic field. That configuration is not natural. It mimics the form used in fusion reactors, in lab-engineered quantum sensors, in high-capacity information arrays. The conclusion is chilling. 3I Atlas has recorded something, and it is about to deliver it. To where, no one can say with certainty, but all simulations of its next trajectory, as of this morning, show the same thing, an angular adjustment so slight it was almost missed, a realignment, one that brings it precisely along Earth's orbital plane. It will not impact, but it will pass close enough to interact with Earth's magnetosphere, perhaps even our upper ionosphere. No natural comet has ever displayed the potential to interact with a planetary field with this degree of precision. And here's what terrifies the scientific community the most. We don't know if the delivery is passive or active. Will it simply pass data through electromagnetic coupling? Or will it release something, particles, signals, fields, that directly affect our systems? Either way, the reversal is done. The message is sealed. The course is set. And Earth is within range. The comet that came from nowhere, that outlived solar fire, that flipped its own tail and silenced observatories across the world, is now preparing for its most precise maneuver yet. We finally know why 3I Atlas reversed its anti-tail, and in less than 24 hours, we will know what for.